Okay, I'm here with Adam Riddell, who's a Senior Account Manager with Crystal PR, and Adam will be joining us at Social Jersey to join our discussion panel. So thank you for coming to have a chat with me, Adam. Just going to ask a couple of questions about public relations in relation to social media. What have you found the impact's been so far on sort of the emergence of social media on public relations?
Well, I guess certainly over the last couple of years, clients have been wanting to know more about how they can integrate social media platforms into their communication plans. So there's certainly been a lot more interest in it over the last couple of years. We tend to work with primarily, not exclusively, but primarily financial services companies. So for them, there's clearly a lot of compliance and regulation issues about how they can actually use social media. So I think the uptake has been pretty slow, and the approach has been pretty cautious. Well, I guess that's to be expected, because if you've got all the regulations and all this compliance, there's compliance issues going on in the background, then that's to be expected.
I think it's interesting, and I mentioned this with Matthew, how HSBC have sort of skirted round the regulations by actually talking about their customers in their Expat Explorer.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the sort of most quoted examples actually of how financial service companies effectively used social media. In that case, Twitter and a sort of associated blog, and that's worked pretty well. And that's worked well, I think, because it's specific to their Expat Explorer survey, which reaches the sort of expat community they're wanting to reach. So it's quite targeted. It's a good example, and this is probably a golden rule I would sort of always go back to when you're talking about public relations and social media, is take a step back when you're approaching social media and actually think about what are we trying to do, what are the very fundamental rules of public relations, what are you trying to say, and who are you trying to say it to. They're quite basic rules, but I think sometimes firms get a bit carried away with trying to use sort of the latest platform, the latest sort of thing, and go ahead and do it without really thinking too much about why they're doing it or who they're trying to talk to. You can have thousands of followers on Twitter, for example, but if it's not the right audience or public that you're trying to talk to, it's not going to make much of a difference. The HSBC example is quite good because it targets the expat community pretty well, and that's exactly who they want to talk to. So yeah, that's a good example.
I think one of the things about traditional PR, it's very much a sort of push medium. You're sending out messages and hoping they get picked up. Now, social media is much more about a conversation. Has that been difficult to incorporate in what you currently do?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a good point, because Facebook and Twitter, which are probably the two most common examples of social media that companies come across, companies tend to think that they are a good way of putting their views across, which is true, but you're absolutely right in that it's also opens up a two-way dialogue with the world, essentially. What's quite an interesting question is that firms often ask, should I be using social media? Which is a bit of an odd question in a way, because whether they like it or not, they already are. People, the users of Facebook, the users of Twitter, might already be talking about their company, regardless of not whether they actually got an account or a profile on that particular platform. So whether they like it or not, they're part of social media. So it's not really a question of should they be using it, but really how should they be using it.
And do you think companies are really... I mean, one of the challenges for companies is the amount of time that is required to do it and to do it well, and how to integrate that into their existing activity. Do you feel that using agencies and outsourcing it is an effective way to do that?
Yeah, it can be. You're right, because sometimes the resources that firms have in-house aren't sufficient to be able to know how to use different platforms effectively, or to measure how they're being used. So yeah, agencies, so particularly specialist agencies, and there are a number in the Channel Islands now who are pretty good at doing that. And I think firms are realising that actually they need to get to grips with that and outsourcing that to an agency can be a good way to do that sometimes.
Do you think that companies are being proactive enough, taking advantage of the opportunities from social media?
In the Channel Islands, do you mean, or?
Yeah, I'd say specifically in the islands.
Yeah. I think, as I said before, it's been pretty cautious, the approach to using social media in the Channel Islands. A good example would be law firms, for example, are normally pretty good at putting out putting their communications across in traditional media. So the logic would be, the next step would be that they would be quite good candidates for using social media platforms to push the messages out even further. But what's got interesting is, I think, of the top 10 law firms in the Channel Islands, I think 3 have accounts on Twitter, and 1 of those 3 actually used it effectively or consistently. So not very many. So when you sort of talking about our firm being proactive enough, not really. As I say, I think it's a pretty cautious approach overall. More widely, I think within the financial services sector, within the FTSE 100 companies, I think it's in terms of those companies that use Facebook, that's gone up in the first 6 months of this year from 25%, 25% to 38% in the first 6 months. So that's increased quite a lot. Similarly, on Twitter, of those companies, that's gone up from 40% to 56%. So there's clearly a drive towards the major companies using social media platforms, but it is pretty slow and pretty cautious.
Thanks very much for coming to talk to me about this, and again, thanks for being able to join us on the Social Jersey panel on the 13th of October.
Look forward to it.